Hi guys, so the old tutorial on NGUI is a little outdated right now, so I think it's time for a new one. In this tutorial I'm gonna assume that the viewers don't know anything about NGUI, so I will be explaining everything quite thoroughly. I've started by creating a brand new project with nothing else in it. However, if you want to import NGUI into an existing project, that's fine too. I'm gonna start by importing the NGUI from a Unity package. I'm actually not gonna import the examples folder because I'll be creating everything from scratch. So now I have NGUI here. Now that I have NGUI, it's a good idea to actually import some images for me to work with. If you don't have any source images of your own, you can just use some example ones that I have here. tasharon.com/ngui/atlas.zip. Inside the zip file, you're going to find a bunch of images to work with. And I'm going to just go ahead and drop them into the project. Now that they're here, I'll organize them a little bit. Textures. And move them here. Now at this point I can start using NGUI. NGUI, create a texture. Now that there's a texture, I just select one of my textures. For example, this one. Now you can actually see it here. Now you can play with it, scale it, move it around, rotate it, whatever you want. Before we move on, let's cover how the pivot works. If you choose the pivot to be top left, for example, which is this setting here, then when you rotate the widget, you'll see it actually rotates around the top left corner. Likewise, if you choose bottom right, guess what? It rotates around the bottom right corner. If you don't like the snapping of angles to be limited by 15 degrees, just hold Shift. This will allow you to fine-tune your rotations. Okay, now if you notice, if you try to change the color tint, nothing is going to happen. That's because the shader used by this texture is actually unlit texture. Let's change it to be something else. NGUI comes with a whole bunch of different shaders that you can use. Ideal one to start with is just the transparent color shader. If you choose this shader, you will notice that the sprite is now colored. Another interesting thing to note, if you're actually targeting mobile platforms, pre-multiplied color shader is gonna give you better performance. But it's a bit of an advanced functionality, so I'm not gonna cover it in this basic tutorial. So now that I have the transparent colored shader selected, I can actually change the color, change the alpha, fade out the image. I can also do things like copy the color and then paste the color, which makes it easy for me to do this if I happen to have multiple widgets. So for example here, I'll have one object and I'll hit Command or Control D, depending on which platform you use, which will duplicate the widget, position it here. Now if I have something here and I give it some perfect color, say for example this blue that I really like, I can just hit copy here, select this guy, paste. One really important thing to know about NGUI is which widget is in front is actually generally determined by two things. If they happen to use the same material, then which one is in front is determined by the depth property. However, if the widgets do not use the same material, like in this case for example, I'm just using UI textures so they're not batched. Which widget is in front is determined by the Z of the transform. Negative Z means it's going to be closer to the camera, which means it's going to be drawn last. Positive Z is the exact opposite. Fortunately, this can be addressed by having an atlas. So let's go ahead and create the first atlas. In order to create an atlas, all I have to do is select the textures that I want to be in an atlas and go to NGUI, open the atlas maker. This gives me an overview of what will happen in this case. I'm gonna add all these sprites as soon as I hit the create button. This will be the name of the atlas. I'm just going to call it example. Now that I've done that, I actually have 3 new files. The material for this atlas, the atlas itself, which is a prefab, and a texture used by the material. Now at this point, it is a good idea to save the scene. So I'm just going to hit Ctrl S to save it, and I'm going to call it test. It is important to know that after every single change to an atlas, you have to save the scene. Now, removing sprites from an atlas is equally simple. With the Atlas Maker open, you can do this. Say, for example, you don't like the following images in the atlas. You want to get rid of them. Select ones you want to get rid of and hit delete, and they will be gone. Adding images to an atlas is equally simple. Select the ones you want to add, and you'll see the add option here. Updating an image, equally simple. Select an image you want to update, and it will show you the update here. So if I wanted to just go ahead and say update this image and add the following ones, I just select them, hit the add update button, and that's it. Now I can actually navigate to the atlas, and all my sprites are going to be here. Well, let's try using them. Save the scene again, and let's see, let's create a sprite. Now here's my sprite. Now I can specify how the sprite is actually drawn, and what sprite this is, for as a matter of fact. So if, for example, I don't like this sprite, I want to change it to something else. No problem. Here we go. Now if I don't like just a regular sprite, I can have it be, say, a tiled sprite. And that's what happens. If I don't like a tiled sprite, well, I can do something like a filled sprite, for example, which will allow me to do things like this. Or, say, for a horizontal health bar, it will be something like that. If I don't like any of this, and I just want to have a sliced sprite, I can do that too. Of course, if I first select it, it's not really going to be sliced. That's because we need to add the slicing information to the image itself. Hit the edit button to go to the sprite itself. Here we can select a border for the sprite, say for example 5 pixels. As we do that, you will notice that the actual sprite changes as well. And now when I return to the sprite here and resize it, you will notice that the border actually maintains the size. If you're curious about the actual geometry generated by NGUI, select the panel and choose the geometry option right here for the debug information. Now if you actually select this guy here, you will notice the actual triangles that NGUI creates. So for a 9 slice sprite, it happens to create 9 quads in total. So now that we have sprites here, it would be a good idea to have text as well. So NGUI, create a label. When you first do this, you will have to specify a font here. Unfortunately, I don't have any fonts yet, so I first need to create one. I'm going to do that by opening up the BM font application on Windows. On a Mac you have a variety of options like Hero, Glyph Designer, BM Glyph I believe, and there's a couple of others. A later version of NGUI is actually going to have dynamic font support, so chances are if you're watching this later on, you might notice some additional options here that'll just simply allow you to specify a true type font. But anyway, in this case we don't have one, so font settings, I'm going to choose Arial is just fine. Size font 32, I'm just going to leave it at default. Export options, I'm going to choose 32 here. And presets, white text with alpha. Now let's see what this looks like. Oh, right, I have to specify which font glyphs to export first. So let's try this again. Yeah, that looks fine. It's important to note that this part here is supposed to say 1/1, meaning you will only have one texture to work with. So I'm gonna save this bitmap font. temp and NGUI video assets font Arial 32. Tab back to Unity. Now there's a font folder with the actual font. Now what we need to do is open up an NGUI font maker tool right here. Now that this is open, we can specify a text file to use for the font's data, an image to use, and let's just name the font. I'm just gonna call it Arial. For the atlas, I'm gonna have it go right into this atlas, so the font and the sprites will be in the same place and end up in the same draw call. And I will create the font. Save, of course. And now I can work with it. I'm going to select my label again and specify this font right here. So now we have text. Alright, say I wanted to do something like, hi there, with a smiley face. But I wanted this smiley face to be an actual emoticon from here. Well, to do that, hit the edit button to go to the font and let's add an emoticon. That would be this one, and hit the add button. There we go. In order to position it properly, I just have to edit the sprite itself and give it some padding. There we go. Left padding controls the distance from the left side. Right one controls the distance from the right side. Top one, obviously, from the top. Fairly straightforward. Alright, let's move on. Now, what I've shown you so far is technically enough for you to start playing with the UI and just creating your own little widgets and whatnot. But there's actually a widget tool to work with. If you go to the NGUI menu and open up the widget wizard right here, you'll be able to specify from a bunch of different prefabs. So if, for example, I wanted to create a button, an actual button, I would choose a background for it, which would be this guy, and just hit the add button, and now there is a button. Well, when I hit play, I can interact with it. How does it actually work? Well, it's actually fairly straightforward. The button itself is a game object with a collider on it. A collider is what receives the event. UI button is a script with the functionality inside that reacts to something happening. In this case, the something is just changing the color of the button if I hover over a button or press on it. Now, the button itself that you see change color is actually this background image right here, which is just a regular sprite. And there's also the label for the text on this button. So if I want to change the text on the button, just select the label itself and do just that. Color, likewise. Change the color of the background, no problem. Select the background and give it a color, whatever you want it to be. Now that was the color of the button. You'll notice that the additional scripts here. Button scale just makes the button scale when I hover over it. Button offset offsets it when you press down on it. And sound actually plays the sound, but in this case I don't actually have any sound, so you don't hear anything. If you don't like this functionality on a button, say for example you did not want it to scale, for example, or have an offset, you just wanted it to have a simple color change, Just remove the components and voila. Think of NGUI as a Lego box. It has the tools that you need to create the UI. But it also doesn't make an assumption that you want your UI components to behave in a specific fashion. You basically get the complete freedom you need to create the UI that you want, not that someone else wants. Well, anyways, let's move on. Let's create a slider. So now that I have a slider using the same button sprites for everything, it doesn't exactly look very nice now, does it? Let's change that. On the actual slider, as you remember, it is just a game object containing widgets inside. I have a background sprite, a foreground, and a thumb. For the background sprite, I'm going to choose something else. Like for example this guy right here. Unfortunately, if I hit play right now, you will notice something. This. That is because, let me disable the sprite so you can see it better. It's because the background sprite doesn't have the slicing information specified. So let's fix that. Hit the edit button to go to the sprite and give it a border. Oops. You can actually see the slicing right here, and it's not exactly perfect. Let's go higher. Let's see, 9. 9's okay. So there we go. That looks better. Now if I go back here and I enable the foreground again and hit play, it will look a bit better. If I don't want this knob thing here, for example, I can just delete it. Now let's say I want to add a checkbox. I'm going to specify a checkbox and just hit add. Now I have a checkbox. Now, just so you guys know, you see how the coordinates here are not pixel perfect? Now you can go through the menu here and GUI and make pixel perfect, or you can just hit Shift Alt P, which is what I generally do. If you're actually dragging the widgets themselves like that, you will notice that they're going to remain pixel perfect. However, if you're dragging a game object, NGUI will not make an assumption for you, so you have to go through this menu or just use the shortcut key. Alt Shift P. So anyway, checkbox. If I wanted to have a bunch of checkboxes set up like that, and say only one of them could be selected, like radio buttons essentially, not checkboxes, I would do this. I would just specify a common root object for them right here, radio button root, for all three of them. So, bit of manual work. There. Now if I actually hit play, only one of them will remain active at a time. Well, let's create a pop-up list. Here's a pop-up list. In order to actually give it different options, I can just modify this here. First, second, third, for example. And now which one is actually selected at the beginning is right here. Say for example, let's start with the third one. Of course you can configure the color of the text. Say for example you wanted it to be black. That's the text in the actual pop-up, by the way. And the background, say you wanted it to be grayish. Now if you hit play and try it again, you'll notice you got a black text on a gray background. And of course it helps to make this a little bit more readable. Here we go. Now, I can resize the background at any time and just change it to be something else, right? Of course, if I do that and then select a pop-up list here, you'll notice that the collider no longer matches. In order to fix that, you can actually do this. And GUI, attach a collider. Attach a collider actually updates a collider if it's already there. So that's it. Now there is an important thing to note. Say if you got a sprite and say you wanted to put this guy and add it here. I'm gonna cover the entire screen pretty much, and I'm gonna change it to be a tiled sprite. Now you'll notice that there are like tiny lines over here. You can actually fix that by editing the sprite and giving it a border. That only affects the tiled sprites. Anyway, right now the sprite is covering everything. In order to bring it back, you adjust the depth property right here. You just keep adjusting it, or just specify a specific value yourself. So as you can see, depth is actually what controls what is drawn in front of what. But there is an exception. For example, if I create a texture here and say choose this one, you will notice that it's actually behind. It is not visible right now. And adjusting the depth is not going to help. Well, there is a warning here that explains what happens. This happens because there's more than one material drawn on the panel. If you select the panel responsible for drawing the widgets in this case, you will notice that there's two materials. One is using the example material, which is the material used with the atlas, and the other one is just the unlit texture. That is the material used by this texture here. Well, in order to bring it forward, you have to adjust the Z value. Negative means closer to the camera, means it's going to be visible. This also holds true if you have multiple panels or use multiple atlases, or if your font is not in your atlas. For example, you have a dynamic font. However, if you do use only one atlas, you'll save yourself a lot of headaches. Well, and this concludes the basic tutorial for NGUI. I hope you found it to be informative. And from this point onwards, I suggest you just dive into the examples and go from there. Thanks for watching.